Alice Unchained. A short story from the Unwitting Conspirators series. Baby, I need you to be brave. Be strong, sweetie. The raspy voice broke. Okay, Mommy, a soft voice replied. Do whatever you have to get back to Mommy, okay? I need you, sweetheart. The recording went silent. The small body perched in front of the frozen screen scooted closer, watching the woman as if she might say something different than she had all those times before. The child reached plump little fingers toward the screen. "Come on, Alice, we can't be late," a voice urged from outside the mouth of the open doorway. The child shot from the ground, unaware that the skirt of her blue dress was stuck in the top of her old-fashioned white bloomers. Footsteps echoed down the hallway toward her as she brushed the vibrant white apron down in front, doing nothing to satisfy the malfunction in back. A slim girl entered the room dressed in a black and white uniform. She moved quickly to the child's side. "Alice, we don't have time to waste." She crouched to one knee so she could be closer to eye level with her little ward. She penetrated the child in her care with a meaningful look. "You have to be what?" she asked, giving the little one's shoulders a subtle shake. "Brave," she murmured, balling something in her tiny fist. "Brave and..." She shook the child a little harder, her expression pinched with internal worry. "Strong, Nanny," she replied, her shoulders giving way to the motion. "That's right. And do you know what it means to be those things, Alice?" the nanny asked, straightening the back of her dress with a sad smile. She looked the child over, giving her a moment to ponder the question. Her little ringlets fell over her shoulders. The blue bows in her hair matched perfectly. "It means don't cry and don't pout." She stuck her lip out to give an example, rocking back to the heels of her naked little feet, with her hands tucked neatly behind her back as she'd been taught. "Alice, you have to be a hero tonight, okay? I know Mommy says you're her little princess, but underneath the pretty dresses and crowns..." Nanny ran her fingers lovingly through the child's curls. "Underneath all those things, that's what every little princess is. They have to be strong, and they have to be brave." Two of her fingers caught unexpectedly on a gnarled knot tucked away in her otherwise perfect Shirley Temple curls. She tisked. "Alice, what is this? You're lucky we found it before leaving. Everything has to be perfect." Nanny combed through lightly until she isolated the problem locks. Tied in the way only a toddler could was a limp little red bow, the only item out of sync and outside the color-coordinated uniform. Nanny chuckled sadly before untangling the bow from the child's mane. "Ow!" All humor drained from Nanny's expression. Like the snap of a whip, she flicked the child hard above the eyebrow. Thunk. "Alice, you know better. That wasn't brave. Tonight, no matter what happens, you don't stop being brave. Do you hear me?" The child's large emerald eyes widened. Neither broke eye contact as a silent pact of obedience was made. The child's lips stiffened. The pain drained from her face. All emotion erased, she nodded slowly and looked straight ahead. "Be brave for your mommy. Everything will be okay if you do exactly as you're told, no matter what," she repeated, shaking the child's shoulders a final time for emphasis. "And no more of this." She lifted the ribbon between her two fingers with an eyebrow. extending the other hand palm open, expectantly. The child didn't move. Her blank resolution stared toward the open door behind Nanny, waiting for further instruction. "Alice, there's no time. We have to go. Now. Give me the rest of them." The little arm lifted. She reached her fist obediently and unleashed several red ribbons from her chubby fist. Still, no emotion cut through her glazed expression. "That's better. That's a good girl." Nanny looked down at the crumpled ribbon bows, eyes narrowing before they widened once more. She recognized the material. She sighed. "Everything will be okay after this, Alice." Nanny extended the first ribbon she'd collected, stuffing it into the child's front apron pocket. "Don't let anyone see it, okay? It'll be our little secret." The child nodded vigorously, in agreement. Nanny rose to her feet, the urgency returning. She thrust her hand out to gather the now empty, limp little fingers. With a yank, they were off at a trot, down the dim, elegant hallway, like two phantoms highlighted in the moonlight that poured through to silhouette the massive hall windows, exposing its full presence in the night sky above them. They rushed past portraits that always seemed to follow Alice with their eyes. The child glanced toward an especially eerie wall painting, one she hadn't remembered being there before. Nanny's hand sailed over the chubby cheek. "Eyes straight forward, Alice," she hissed, snapping her fingers. "I won't always be there to remind you. You have to do this yourself. Stay focused." The child obeyed immediately, face expressionless, minus a tremor in her lower lip. "We don't have time for this. We can't be late. This is an important date, Alice. It's what we've been working toward." "It's almost over. This is the end of it." Nanny swept the child into her arms as she spoke. She ran over the final stretch of rich marbling and dark mahogany, taking the stairs two at a time, commanding her passenger to fasten its arms around her neck while she reached an arm to the banister for balance. Alice faced backward, bobbing over her shoulder, wondering what might happen and why she'd been forced awake so late. She continued pondering as she blinked herself awake, watching the hallway disappearing behind so many spiral stairs. She thought of the kindness Nanny showed by letting her keep the ribbon, even though she'd tried to hide it from her at first. She squeezed Nanny's neck a little harder. Nanny was like a magical elf when she was happy. When it was just the two of them, she would play better than anyone Alice's own age. When Nanny was happy, Alice was happy. When she was happy, the child could feel the glow of her approval. It was better than the best sunshine. Alice craved her attention. She wished to please her. To be a good girl in Nanny's sight, she would even play pretend when told. Tonight would be no different. The child closed her eyes, thinking of the red bow resting in the pocket pressed between them. "Mommy loves you. Mommy loves you. The milky voice rushed in around them as they burst into the chilled midnight air. "No time for shoes. We'll lace them in the limo," Nanny hissed again. The child squeezed in, focusing on the smiling face of the woman still frozen to the screen they'd left in her upper playroom. Nanny rushed toward the stretched vehicle, spitting warm exhaust in little clouds toward the full moon. "You're late," the driver snarled through clenched teeth. "No, if you don't drive fast, we will be," Nanny countered, all but tossing the bundle in her arms to the seat before leaping in. The door slammed on her heels. The blindfold that had been pulled over her eyes might have startled Alice had Nanny not made a game of it beforehand. For months leading up to this point, Alice had practiced pouring tea at their parties this way. It had been a fun game at certain moments, and others her knuckles still throbbed from. After they'd left the vehicle, Nanny had led her this way and that, and Alice had followed obediently after, all the while feeling more and more as though she were walking on air. It must have been the tea Nanny had given her on the way to where they currently were. "Alice," Nanny hissed, "remember, say nothing unless asked specifically. Always say yes or no to begin with, and under no circumstance will you go by or answer to any name but Alice. Do you understand me?" The child pondered the request, while following along obediently. Fuck! Nanny landed a swift swat to the skull full of bouncing curls. Alice cupped her free palm over her mouth to keep from whimpering, which earned her a flick to the forehead. "Alice, no hand gestures unless you're told to do so. Hands always at your sides when you walk. You know these things, Alice. Keep up now. Come on, we're going to be late." Nanny's eyes glistened in the moonlight with an unspoken vengeance as they passed over the final spans of the vast hallway. As they neared the final double doors marking the end of their journey together, Nanny came to a stop. A single lamp lit the way, casting warm light to dance over the elegant carvings in the double doors, but the stories coming to life over the wooden surfaces went unnoticed. Nanny dropped to a knee, looking the child over, brushing away a few rogue wrinkles left from the limo ride. The little one couldn't see anything through the silk blindfold wrapped over her eyes. A piece of her wanted to reach up and pull the material down so she could get a good look at her surroundings. Another to scratch the itch at her nose. And the remaining pieces knew any motion would receive swift punishment. So she stood as still as she could while Nanny primped and prodded. "Remember everything we talked about, Alice. This is it. This is the last thing you have to do before we go home with Mommy." Alice nodded, sheltered from the fear glistening in Nanny's eyes. She'd begun to lift the watch at her wrist when the barrier broke apart. The mouth opened, exposing a gap large enough for a small child. The slender girl rose, her shaking hands falling submissively over Alice's shoulders in the blue glow unleashed. Low, eerie voices spilled from beyond the doors, invading the silence. "Follow the light," came the command. The child, dressed in her blue and white costume, hesitated before stepping forward. "Be brave, Alice." As she reached her hand out to act as a guide, it was taken by another not much larger than her own. Nanny watched with building dread as a slightly older version, wearing the same uniform, led her Alice away. All she could do now was wait. Her life hanging in the balance, her hope clinging to a child just barely 3. The 2 children disappeared. The door closed quietly behind them. And again, Nanny was alone in the dim corridor. Alice let the cold hand lead her forward. She stopped when the hand stopped. No words passed between them, and as the fingers fell away into thin air, Alice didn't move. Nanny appeared through the darkness. "If you ever want to see Mommy again, you have to do what you're told, no matter what." Nanny's voice drifted to the back of Alice's imagination as the silk surrounding her eyes tugged free. The soft material fell from her face, eyes straight forward. Nanny's phantom whispered from between Alice's eyes. As soon as her soothing voice disappeared, it was followed by a thunderous, low rumble rising from everywhere around her. The light, the sound, the sudden foul odors that Alice couldn't quite place. She nearly crinkled her nose at the sensory overload, stopping just in time to notice 3 others standing in 3 separate doorways, lining each wall beside her own. They were each dressed identical to herself. Alice wanted to look down. She wanted to compare notes. But every muscle in her body twitched against itself in an abnormal show of willpower for one so young. The others remained frozen as well, pinned in place and awaiting further instruction. The rumble became more distinct, and for the first time since entering the strange room, Alice could hear a voice through the vibrations. It was repeating a phrase over and over again. She couldn't quite hear the words being formed, but the reverberation was lifting the hair from her skin in all the wrong places. The size of the room sunk in as she took in the child standing across from her. Its long, straight hair, the same shade as the silk that had fallen from the face of each, blacker than black. This new child's pale skin was striking against the dark veil falling over her shoulders to highlight her blue and white uniform. From a distance, she looked like Snow White in a mismatched costume. Alice didn't dare try to see the other 2, as they were both outside of her peripheral view, and the longer they stood waiting, the quicker her little heart beat with anticipation, until it was racing against the tempo of the inaudible words echoing from every wall of the room. Something like fear consumed her, and for a moment, Alice thought to turn around and rush toward the door, to accept Nanny's punishment and go home. The thought passed. Her feet remained firmly planted on the ground. Don't do anything unless you're told. Her ears burnt in response to the command. Be brave. Alice imagined the red ribbon resting in her apron pocket. She had protection. As promised, the final gift bestowed by her mother before she'd been taken, they'd been tested and proven to keep the creatures of the night away. Take these, baby. Always remember, Mommy loves you. They'll protect you from monsters. So long as you're not afraid, don't forget, sweetie. Her emerald eyes glazed while she stared into eternity. She imagined the pocket beginning to glow and break the sounds of violence rising to join with the inaudible chanting. The child across from her moved, drawing her attention back to the horror playing before them. A slightly taller blonde figure was holding the Snow White child by the hand, drawing her forward. Alice blinked. She hadn't seen the row of dark hooded figures who'd appeared at the center of the room, or the mist that seemed to have followed them. She could see the Snow White child through the space between the hooded figures. The closer the child came to the center of the vast room, the more clear her large, frightened eyes became. From the shadows, another figure drifted forward, face veiled, but she wore an outfit identical to Nanny. Alice peeked from the corner of her eye with all of her might toward the fragile hands resting crossed in front of the veiled character. Alice blinked away her disappointment. There was no scar below the middle finger of the imposter's left hand. If you get scared, just take 3 big breaths. Alice obeyed the internal direction. Bigger than you think you can. She nodded slowly. 1, 2, 3. Her heart began to slow. Suddenly, her imagination spun into life. She was in a meadow, seated on a checkered blanket. There were bubbles rising all around her. The tightness in her chest lifted with the mist pouring in beneath the doors, unseen through her little oasis. The base of the robes had disappeared as it crept in at their feet, giving off the illusion that the shadow figures were floating. "What is your name?" a deep voice boomed. The unknown child's lower lip trembled. Alice, she replied quietly. Very good. The room seemed to tremor. Alice, it began again. Do you want to live? Yes, the little voice returned. Then take this. Two shadows at either end of the line moved to a point, standing together in front of the little one, blocking Alice's view of the snow-white child. Her own legs began to quake in the building's silence as she wondered what might be happening beyond the wall of dark material. The two bowed down after a brief pause and stepped away to reveal the snow-white child. Alice released the breath she'd been holding. Eat it, the voice commanded. The snow-white child lifted her first hand on command, like a marionette on strings. It rose and fell limp to her side. She chewed and swallowed its contents. Her expression revealed nothing. She looked through Alice, awaiting the next command as her mouth stopped moving. Drink it, drink it. She drew a little red vial to her lips, but this time, as she took it into her mouth, her face turned sour. She gagged, trying to swallow. After a struggle, a whimper issued as she spit the liquid to the floor between she and the looming shadows. The figure dressed as Nanny quivered. Alice looked to the two children at the center of the massive arena. She watched the older child lead Snow White through the blue glow. Together they stepped in front of the quaking caretaker. The blonde child lifted her hand, as if expecting this Nanny's pale hand to accept. Through the silence, a whimper. A frail hand rose to meet the smaller. The Nanny's fingers hesitated inches away in a final rebellion before submitting themselves to be joined. The blonde child led the two toward the opening mouth of a door Alice hadn't noticed before. They disappeared into the blackness as the teeth of the door locked back into place. Alice wondered if she might see them again. She was accustomed to these things not making any sense, but this was the first, in her memory, that she'd experienced without Nanny by her side. Don't make a peep, not a sound. You don't want them to take you back underground. Do you understand me, Alice? Alice loved how Nanny always seemed to rhyme things. It made them easier to remember. Alice clenched her fists, determined not to let Nanny down. She'd show her just how strong and brave she could be. Do what they tell you. Everything will be okay, I promise. If you remember everything we've practiced, we'll make it through this final thing, Alice. The robed figures turned in unison, a full 180, to face Alice. She kept her eyes straight forward, taking in 3 deep breaths while trying not to count them out on her chubby little fingers. The girl standing next to her held a hand up in Alice's view. She took it, allowing herself to be led forward. Together they stopped a slide length away from the hooded shadows. Her eyes remained glued through the center of the waistline and torso looming before her. The blue silence swallowed everything, until finally the figure boomed. What is your name? Alice. It came naturally. Alice had to keep herself from looking toward the point in the room she thought Nanny might be standing, so she could see the look of approval stamped over her face. But on the outside, she remained stone-faced. As the hand that had guided Alice fell away, hers had done the same. The tea Nanny had given her had come on like a blanket. A warm, fuzzy numbness had descended through the hazy blue hue, and nothing on the outside seemed to penetrate it. Very good, the deep voice replied. It felt familiar, a voice Alice had heard before, though she didn't dare look up to confirm it. Alice, it began again, do you want to live? Yes, she replied along to the apparent script. Then take this, it finished. Shadows moved through her peripherals as if following a choreographed line through the carpet of mist, licking at their invisible heels. They took their place before her, blocking the first shadow to extend their offerings. Alice took them obediently. Holding a morsel of cake and a small vial in each hand, she waited for the next command, anticipating what taste might have made the first spit it out. The shadows receded to reveal the speaker. Eat it, came the booming instruction. So she did. Beside the aftertaste, it had been painless. Her face remained slack. Drink it, the shadow demanded evenly. She did like Nanny taught her, swallowing without using her nose and without complaint. It wasn't until she breathed in again that she caught the pungent aftertaste of pennies. Her stomach began churning, though her silence betrayed nothing. Alice could almost feel Nanny's relief. Her eyes remained forward, heart in the pocket with the secret ribbon. Very good. With that, her guide took her hand and led her away. She wanted so badly to look at Nanny for guidance. As they approached her veiled figure from the center of the room, Alice felt Nanny's smile, even if it hadn't painted itself over her face. She knew it was going to be okay. She'd done everything she was supposed to. In the same fashion as the last, the blonde child attached to Alice reached for Nanny's hand. When she accepted it, they all moved toward a separate door in the opposite wall from the one Snow White Alice had taken. Alice's confidence drained. She felt confused. Her heart picked up pace. Why had they gone a different way? Everything else had been the same. The thoughts ran in circles around her mind as the door shut, leaving them in complete darkness. The thoughts circulated as the lock clicked closed again. They were in the dark. This time, not even the dim ambience that had shone through the silk bandana before was apparent. The doors had closed behind them, snuffing the blue glow from sight. Not even a wink remained. A moment later, a flame flickered awake. The guide had lit a match and was bent over a large lantern. Her long blonde hair fell forward to shield her face. It seemed to gather the flickering light shadows to dance within their bounds. When she stepped back, she held the lantern by an iron ring at its top. The encased fire danced at its own whims as its casing barely swayed with her graceful movements. Without looking, the guide reached her free hand out to Alice, who took it obediently, following after as she noticed Nanny made no move to follow. Together the two began their journey through the eerie hallway. Eyes forward. You know what happens when you don't listen, Alice. She blinked away the imaginings poking out of the darkness. You can look around. The melodic voice came from her companion. I won't tell anyone, she finished. Alice ventured to look her way. The light seemed to be dancing now. The flame inside the lantern had grown and felt as though it might touch the ceiling, though it never left its compartment. The guide stared straight ahead. What'd they tell you? She felt electricity in her hands at the point of contact between she and her guide. Alice's skin felt blazing hot and ice cold all at once. The walls seemed to dance closer and further with each step they took. The light and its shadows played tricks on Alice's sleep-deprived mind. She nearly stumbled as the lantern glow led them deeper and deeper into the mysterious hallway. There was a hiss through the darkness, followed by a distant scream and eerie giggling. Each step seemed to bring on more noise, until the whispers all screamed the same thing at different octaves and intervals. Control the children, the children, control the children, the children, the children, control the children. Repeated from all directions, so loudly at some points that Alice nearly stopped in her tracks. You can look around. The voice of her guide sliced through the rest. I won't tell anyone. At this, Alice looked up. The face of her companion seemed to be melting in place. Nothing made sense. Alice couldn't pull all the pieces together as her internal calm began to shatter. Just as she was lifting her free hand to plug an ear, a new phrase grabbed her curiosity. The flowers, remember the flowers, remember the flowers. The voice sounded just like her mother. Instinctively, instead of inserting itself into her ear, the little hand pressed against her lips, forcing them to stay closed. She nearly caved. The fake had nearly convinced her. After this, you'll be able to see Mommy. After this. Nanny's instructions whispered inside, cutting through the noise of Alice's surroundings. I'm still here. It isn't after. Mommy isn't here. That isn't Mommy. Alice reasoned with herself. It's part of their game, she thought. The second phrase grew louder. Remember the flowers, remember the flowers. Control the children, control the children, control the children. Until they felt interchangeable, forming a double helix of intoxifying confusion. Alice had been so tied in their bonds, she forgot where she was. And in the meantime, a new sensation was added to the mix. Just beyond the reaches of the lantern, a blue crack of light had formed. Like a moth to the flames, Alice's eyes widened, and her uncoordinated steps took the lead. Anything to get away from this darkness and its whispers. The crack widened as they drew closer. Alice's guide stepped back as Alice came to a stop to peek through the doorway without entering. The guide pushed Alice hard. She stumbled through the doorway. The whispers still circulated, but more quietly. There were mirrors. The hair on the nape of her neck stood on end. There were so many mirrors, and no clear way to move through them, each offering her own face staring back blankly. The light made the small child's lips look dark, purple even. Look around. I won't tell anyone. The sweet voice echoed between the mirrors. Alice looked over her shoulder to find her guide had disappeared. Find the way, Alice. It finished. The midnight lights began to dim. Alice blinked. Terror rose up in her throat. She wasn't the only one in the mirrors anymore. A shadow had run across them just before bright blue flashes of light strobed all around her, disorienting her further. Alice. Nanny's voice rang through her mind, drowning out all other sounds. Alice, get through this. Be brave. You'll be safe so long as you aren't afraid. Fear makes us stupid. Fear makes us stupid. Alice opened her eyes. To her relief, she was the only one in the mirror again, and the light had returned to normal. Know yourself, Alice, or you can be convinced of anything. Alice felt as though Nanny were talking all around her, though she knew it couldn't be true. She had left her back at the first door. The vials she'd been given to drink felt different this time, but each time had been similar in that it left her feeling less and more herself all at once. Nothing made sense, which made sense because these events never did. It felt as though she'd entered into an unescapable sleep, and she was simply swimming through a bad dream. Each step further into it felt like a shepherd's crook pulling her deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, closer to the core of the nightmare passed on through her blood. They'll tell you it's your fault. She remembered one of Nanny's confusing whispers behind closed doors, in secret, while she tucked Alice into bed. But you listen to me. It isn't your fault. Do what you're told. Be a good girl. And someday, a good night will take you away from all of this. I promise. Nanny could be so kind. A loud cackling broke out, followed by crazed howling, bringing Alice back to the present and the maze of mirrors standing between she and freedom. The sound drew terror from Alice's belly. She'd heard the howling before, in person, though she couldn't quite remember where. Her steps quickened. She did her best to navigate the endless maze, but kept running into walls. She'd come to another dead end, when the lights shuddered again. When they returned to normal, a new figure had taken its place over the glass faces. Dark curls covered the downcast face of a figure dressed in black, no taller than Alice. Her little hands rested behind her back, and in her hair she wore red bows, much like the one hidden in her pocket. The lights shuddered again, revealing her form closer in appearance as they returned. When things show up, don't acknowledge them unless you can touch them. Look straight ahead, little dove. Be cunning. Nanny echoed. Alice hadn't known the meaning behind her cryptic Nanny's poems when she'd first said them, but they seemed to fit perfectly for her current situations. So she looked quickly down at her white dress. The apron pocket had opened its mouth to expose her priceless gift, her secret weapon. These will keep you safe from the monsters. The echo blew ice through her broiling terror, calming her in the face of the creature standing before her. The dark version in the mirror wistfully pulled a hand from behind her back as she lifted her head to reveal an emaciated face and huge green eyes. It drew a single finger to black lips. The reflection smiled slowly, its eyes reduced to a black sliver surrounded in dark liner, creating the illusion she had hollow sockets where her eyes should be. The noises bearing down around Alice were straight from a reoccurring nightmare. Remember, Alice, none of this is real, okay? Play the game, little dove. Be brave. How many times had Nanny repeated those things? It was as if she'd known all along what would happen. Alice looked straight forward as the dark figure approached from all directions. Her movements were rigid and jerky. Still, Alice stood unmoved. The milky feeling inside made the outside more murky than ever. It isn't real, she told her little heart as it threatened to pick up speed again. Nanny said so. This was just another in a string of monsters her mother's bows protected her from. The lights flashed again. The screams and laughs and horrid voices grew louder. When the flash faded, a new shadow had entered the walls of the infinite mirrors. Kneeling at the feet of the dark child was a veiled girl with the same frame as Nanny. The new figure's dark lips were moving slowly over the surface of each mirror and into eternity. Alice couldn't be sure what they were saying. Everything felt blurred and hazy. She couldn't think of anything clearly. If none of this was real, then it was at the very least curious. It looked real, The sounds were real. Alice pinched herself discreetly, and in the same moment the pain of it shot up her arm. The lights strobed again. The dark reflection brought a finger to her lips, pulling a large knife from behind her back. The way it shone looked very real. Alice grew more confused than ever, as a feeling of being tucked beneath warm blankets consumed her. How could she feel so weightless in a moment like this? The knife in this dark version's hands might as well have been flowers. Seeing Nanny dressed in her formal attire was almost amusing. Alice watched the cold steel disappear and reappear through the sternum of the caretaker.
What a clever trick,
she thought. She observed the graceful motion as the icy weapon pulled from its place to disappear behind the child's back once more. At its retreat, the veiled impostor fell to the ground. Black liquid shimmered in the midnight light. Alice might have been afraid if Nanny hadn't told her the secret. She wondered if the other child would have been less afraid if she'd known all of this was a grown-up game. And to win, all one must do was keep going. Alice touched the treasure pocket. Her fingers fell into a fist as she resisted the urge to drift away. Control the children, control the children, the children, the children, control the children. Out of habit, she looked at the limp hand that had fallen outstretched toward her through the mirror. Black snakes crept from beneath the make-believe Nanny. Alice leaned in, squinting to get a better look. It was just as she'd thought. There was clear skin where a scar should have been. If you're ever not sure that it's me, look for the scar at my middle finger, Dove. If all else fails, that's how you'll know me. That's my present to you. Alice's heart remained steady. It was uncanny how much Nanny's cryptic poetry made sense. It was as if she'd known what would happen before it did. Alice heard a motion behind her and turned to see that where there'd been a mirror blocking her way, there was now a pitch-dark opening. A ways into the secret tunnel, she could see the warm glow of lamplight. Alice crawled in and hurried to the end. Sure as she'd been, she stumbled into view of the little blonde guide who'd abandoned her at the room's entrance. Without glancing down at her young friend's fumbled entrance, she drew a finger to her lips and whispered, "I won't tell anyone." Alice anticipated her hand being offered, and when it wasn't, and the light bearer moved forward without taking hold of her, Alice again felt unsure. She stayed where she was, thinking this another test. The voices from the mirror room whispered in through the tunnel on a polluted breeze. The lamp bearer spun to face Alice. "Come, or you'll be late." The guide's voice fell away to the ticking of an invisible clock. The repetitious noise boomed suddenly, again and again. Alice could feel it vibrating through her tingling skin. Realizing how little herself she felt, Alice scampered forward without further prompting. The clock died to the background while a new scene began taking form. The lantern glow betrayed little of the space. Its flame seemed to have died down to cover only their feet and its safety. The voices echoing between untethered laughter nearly muted the faint screams beneath. It sounded as if their sentences were being rewound at a normal pace and out loud. Alice's eyes were caught by a string of upside-down and slightly crooked portraits as they passed. "You can look around," the familiar voice of the guide piped in through the nonsense, a singular voice of reason. "I won't tell anyone." And there it was again, the foreboding instruction that, in the past, had earned her punishment for following. It's just a game. Do as they say, and always follow commands, not suggestions. Nanny's prior instructions over tea replayed through Alice's tortured memory. A singular light in the present darkness. Alice held tight to the pocket containing her secret weapon, and upon recognizing her guide's instruction as a suggestion, Alice's eyes snapped straight ahead, just in time to catch a woman with an animal head walking backward into the lamplight. Alice's guide slowed to allow the ghastly figure to glide before them in its strange fashion. Alice looked to the point it had come from as the door it had exited closed. Mist licked out below it in little fingers to beckon them forward. Alice's guide had dropped to a hunker around their only light source, her bright hair once again dancing with the glow, casting otherworldly shadows to the walls of the massive hallway. When the lamp bearer rose, she revealed a larger flame. Her free hand pointed toward the double doors. Enter. Alice moved forward obediently. Her body felt light as a feather. Untethered, she gripped the elegant metal work of the knob and twisted, slicing her finger on some unseen object in the process. Alice bit her tongue to keep from gasping. She fought the tears building in her eyes with desperation. You can cry all you want, but it doesn't do a thing. Brave girls go on living. Don't let them see you cry. Nanny's advising poured from the gushing wound. Though it was alarming, Alice hadn't felt any pain. The pinch she levied against herself had felt more real than the deep gash pumping her life source from it. Alice pushed the barrier from its housing to step through the frame. This room held a blue hue also, only slightly darker. The low conversations were inaudible and added to the building confusion. Alice couldn't see straight, or maybe she could see just fine and it was the room that was off-kilter. The pictures on the walls were upside down. To confirm her second notion, Alice's eyes followed a man in an animal mask as he walked backward from picture to picture, nodding slowly in admiration, the way she'd seen so many adults doing across too many museum visits to count. Even his nods were in reverse. Through the low murmur of mayhem, a single audible voice could be heard. How completely absurd. Utterly mad. It's nonsense, I tell you. The voice repeated itself again and again, finally ending with, They're not to be trusted. And the loop would cut short to begin again. Alice walked straight as she was able over the crooked space of the room, eventually turning backward herself so she'd better blend in her attempt to make it to the opposite wall. Everything felt wrong. The death grip she held over her pocket went slack with horror as her eyes danced from picture to picture in the process. If her little mind could comprehend despair, it was what she felt the moment she realized the upside-down gallery gracing the walls held images of children, no older than herself. Some horribly maimed, others hung upside down, some screaming with dirty cheeks streaked in tears. Remember, Dove, it's not real. It's just a bad dream. They want to see you're a brave little girl, and then you'll go back to Mommy. I promise I won't let anything happen to you, not over my dead body. Tonight will be different than they think it's going to be, but you have to play along with the charade. Alice's knees quaked as she regained balance. Find the way, Alice. The melodic voice of her guide piped up. Her finger pointed silently toward the wall Alice was walking backward to. Any object that wasn't moving appeared to be melting through the blue light. Alice could feel the contents and their eyes pressing in around her as she launched toward the double doors. As she spun around and launched out toward the double doors she'd aimed to reach, Without a thought, she grabbed the knob of one and was met with a hearty shock. This time she yelped. Alice covered her mouth in horror as she realized she'd broke the golden rule. Not a peep. Her bleeding hand throbbed against her lips. "It's okay. I won't tell." Her guide's faint voice broke in. Alice spun to find her standing in the middle of the room, lamplight in hand. "Things aren't always what they seem. Look for a less likely opening." Alice couldn't be sure anymore if the voices were coming from inside or outside herself. She didn't feel sure of anything at the moment. She'd had worse nightmares lately, only to wake up where she'd first fallen asleep. So it might be that this was a dream too. To be afraid of something that isn't really there would be silly, wouldn't it? Alice nodded slowly to the veiled advice from Nanny. "Don't be afraid," she told herself again. Oh, how she wished Nanny was here to help her think more clearly. What she wouldn't do to wake up. Alice looked fatally around the upside-down gallery, finding nothing that resembled a door. Her eyes fell defeated to a statue, pointing to a corner of the room masked in tapestries, depicting all kinds of horrid scenes, in tune with the rest of the gallery. Alice glanced toward the entrance she'd come from. There were bubbles of color surrounding the characters moving along backward in their various patterns. Alice's hazy gaze danced through them, coming to rest over a single figure who remained still. She focused in hard. It felt as though little spiders were climbing every inch between her shoulders and fingertips. She could almost see them. Standing in front of the door, head down and hands behind her back, was the child from the mirror. She appeared to glitch, disappear, and reappear before a couple walking arm in arm blocked her from Alice's sight. As they moved on, the phantom was gone. "You're going to be late," her guide's voice hissed over the backward whispers, drawing her eyes back to the horrid tapestry. The little blonde girl had peeked her head from behind the thick material, her hand silently bidding Alice forward. She rushed ahead, stumbling on a throw rug's edge she hadn't seen. Don't worry. Again, a loud thundering of a ticking clock vibrated the walls, drowning out the haunted whisper Alice knew all too well. She could feel each second in her tired feet as they reached the cloth cloaking the hidden passageway from her sight. This one was a little wooden door. The gaping faces carved into its surface might have frightened Alice, had she not been convinced it was all a dream. Dreams could be frightening, and they too could leave her feeling weightless, as if suspended in air. It was the only thing that made sense. And only in dreams might a wooden face's lips appear to be moving, as the ones on the door did. Alice shivered as the hall she'd entered into went dark. The blue glow cast away from the opening by the thick wall of tapestry draping in around it. Alice took a few steps forward, stretching her hands as far in each direction as she could without touching anything. Little fingers of cold rushed in around her. She shivered again. Take 3 big breaths, precious. When you feel nervous or unprepared, scared or angry, close your eyes and imagine your breaths are flowers. 1, 2, 3. The phantom of laughter drew Alice forward through the dark in the nick of time. As she found her feet, a new sound entered the quiet atmosphere. Snarling, like a rabid dog, Alice spun to see red glowing eyes staring unblinkingly at her in the direction she'd come from. She yelped. For the first time, unable to convince herself to stand her ground, Alice bolted. Stumbling over the uneven ground, she made her way forward. She couldn't hear over her labored breathing, but she could almost feel the beast's hot breath on the back of her neck. She could hear it snorting with exertion as it caught up, and as the fear consumed her, Alice threw herself to the ground in a final attempt to escape. She shook like a leaf in a thunderstorm, sure she was moments from being torn to shreds. But as her breathing slowed, silence embraced her. Alice lifted her hands from the ground, pulling herself to kneel upright. Only in dreams could such things be so very real, only to disappear. The fear Alice felt faded. Nanny had been right again. She frowned into the thick darkness and bent to run her fingers over the soft surface she'd fallen upon. Alice nearly smiled, realizing what a silly thought she was in. She grabbed a handful of dirt and moved forward at a crawl, feeling her way along the floor. It was all made of dirt, but how could that be? Only moments before, she'd been in a rich gallery, and now, somehow she'd found herself in the beginnings of a flower bed or a garden. None of it made any sense. Another burst of cold air rushed in around Alice, pricking at her sensitive skin in a most unkind way. The smell of fresh-cut lawn and roses reached her nostrils, filling her with the promise of an end. The cold disappeared from her mind as she rose to her feet. Maybe she was nearing the end of the dream, and she could finally ascend from the nightmare and open her eyes into the morning sunrise, tucked safely beneath her blankets. Alice's brain swum, her sight gone. She let go of the need to see completely, as Nanny had instructed so many times before. The slope in the floor dipped more quickly than Alice's little feet could account for. Fumbling, she stumbled and rolled for what felt like an eternity. The fog in her mind kept her abilities one step behind her tumbling body. And when she finally halted, she blinked open the eyes she'd closed instinctively. The ground where she'd stopped felt less forgiving, but she could see. There was a midnight light pouring in from the opening, just ahead. There appeared to be a hole full of stars and moonlight. Her eyes fell to the steep incline leading to it. It was separated by a bed of jagged rocks that began an arm length away from her current resting point. On hands and knees, she felt her way through the graveyard of pointed stones. Alice whimpered lightly as an especially hungry one bit into the palm of her hand. In the moonlight, Alice spotted a large dark imprint of liquid left behind, as if a giant colored marker had been stamped down hard into the rock's surface. She pulled a pulverized palm in front of her face. The soft skin was grated on the pad below her thumb. And just above, for the first time, she saw what the sharp point on the knob had done to her hand. From pointer to the far end of the pad below her middle finger, her hand had been sliced wide open. Dirt from the tunnel had mixed in, so it looked like dark chocolate cake batter. Alice's belly rumbled. Conscious of her wounds, she lifted to unsure feet. The rocks appeared to dance and swirl from this view. Alice felt nauseous. She swayed back and forth to stay upright. Her poor dress caught her eye. It was a mess. Her lip trembled. Oh, the trouble this would earn her. "This is the last of it, darling. Just keep going when you feel like you can't. Just know the end is right over the horizon. Don't give up. Keep moving, even if you don't know where to go." Alice straightened her lower lip as she brushed the excess wrinkles and dirt clumps from her tattered dress. The throbbing in her hand was very real at the moment. The clever child held it out to the moonlight, letting the throb act as a beacon, a guide, as she navigated without misstep over the pointy surface. Alice followed her fingertip with her eyes, without looking down until the tip of her shoe sunk into the ground. Alice nearly clapped for joy as she rushed ahead, sure she would finally be met by her dear mother the moment she peeked from the hole. She all but forgot the bow in her muddied apron pocket as she labored against the incline, scaling it and grabbing carelessly at the loose, large clods as if they were always meant to be handholds. Not one gave way. Each held fast for her. The drive to feel safe in her mother's arms outweighed the stinging in her injured hand. The aches in her body from the tumble made it hard to decide which end of it hurt worse. Her little knees were bloody from the rocks, and if she showed up late to wherever she was heading, Alice could only imagine the punishment that would be the cherry on top of it all. She reached the top of the ridge and pulled her little torso up over the ledge, only to find she was surrounded by hedges. She wriggled out of the hole, pulling her bare legs in around herself as she tried to warm up in the cold open air. Lost, little one? The voice crept in from somewhere in the trees, extending all around the ring of bushes. Their canopies hadn't blossomed enough to block the midnight sky. Unlike the unnatural blue glow in the last few rooms, this shade soothed her. The moonlight fed her spirit. Alice closed her eyes. She accepted its soft glow as if she were welcoming an old friend. She breathed in, the fog in her brain covering the untethered voice momentarily until it piped in again. I asked you a question. Are you dumb or rude? Mind you, the smooth, unseen creature's hiss carried a thinly veiled threat on its breath. Neither is good. Neither befitting a princess. It purred. Alice's eyes shot to the trees. First dark shadows, then disappearing snarling hounds, now this, whatever it was. Alice's eyes shot to the trees, overwhelmed at the disappointment of not finding her mother. Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes, she admitted, not knowing what else to say. Always start there. The laughter that broke through Nanny's final instruction was anything but friendly. Yes, Alice clasped her hands behind her back in a show of submissive respect, eyes intuitively downcast. She looked to the hole she'd crawled from. A beam from the moon above twinkled against the spiky rocks beneath as she tried to find the one bearing her blood. Tick-tock, what a sad night it would be for you to be late, the invisible creature taunted, seeming less friend and more foe by the moment. Can you help me find the way? She asked. You haven't told me where you're going. A ravenous cackle howled toward the moon, sending a murder of crows into the sky above them. How can I help you if I don't know that? But I don't really know. The girl with a dress like mine and a light was taking me somewhere. She left me, and I don't know where we were going. You mean to tell me you left your companion behind, down that hole? Tisk tisk, shame on you. A shadow dropped from a low bough to disappear into the bushes beneath, right in front of Alice. She was sure of it. She'd seen something fall, and now the bushes were shaking wildly. As suddenly as the mayhem erupted, it ended. The underbrush fell silent. But if you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't much matter which way you go, does it? Won't any old way work in such a case? Alice puzzled over the question. It did make some sort of sense, but then she never felt she knew anything for certain, or where she was going most of the time. And yet, some things she'd chosen had been wrong enough to leave scars in the end, inside and out, though she could never quite remember where each had come from. In the shadow of a doubt cast, Alice remained silent. Another hiss of laughter lashed out to break the building quiet. Alice couldn't take her gaze away from the now still bushes. sure that the moment she did, her opponent might make itself known through them. "You've got brass nuts, kid. The queen'll be quite pleased." The sound of something chopping echoed through Alice's unconscious, followed by the sudden urge to rush back to the safety of the hole she'd just crawled from. Through the fear, she imagined the woman, still frozen on the screen in her playroom. Alice imagined herself running into the arms of her mother. "This is real," the internal voice argued as the imagining disappeared. "What you're in is nothing but a bad dream." While the words were still echoing, a blue face appeared through the bushes. Alice froze, her breath caught as yellow eyes blinked back at her. "What's wrong?" it purred, pushing forward to expose cat ears and a wild, ruffled blue mane. Alice blinked as the feline-esque character continued. "Not what you were expecting?" It hopped from the bushes. Alice felt more confused than ever. The creature appeared to be a cat in a man's body, wearing nothing but elaborate paint with tufts of fur around his waistline, ankles, and wrists. The tops of his hands and feet were covered in blue fur also. Alice squinted into the midnight skin, detecting intricate designs and markings. "You are quite a mess, aren't you?" The whiskers glittered in the moonlight as the creature assessed her. It stepped forward, lips splitting to expose a second set of teeth, while those painted in around it never moved. In the low glow, the creature was beginning to look more monstrous by the moment. Alice's hand strayed again to its pocket for reinforcement.
"I just need to get through this. If you could point me to wherever's next, please."
Her voice remained monotone, to her surprise, completely disconnected from the internal fear and doubt kindling a fire in her belly. He crossed his arms over his chest, pointing with 2 fingers in each direction. Wrong answer. Have you listened to a thing I've said?" He smiled wickedly. His eyes traced over her hungrily before resting on her injured hand. "It appears you're bleeding. Come with me. We can at least attend to that. I'd hate for the queen to see you in such a state." The cat rushed forward, kicking up its heels as it grabbed her by the injured hand's wrist. It turned and dragged her back toward and then through the bushes it had come from. The branches scraped and scratched mercilessly, though the blue cat creature appeared unfazed by it. Laughing all the way, the beast skipped, hopped, and bounded through the thick underbrush, emerging to reveal a decrepit street, a shell of the life it may have once been. It seemed to set crooked, all of it, including the buildings. Alice drank in the scene once she'd accounted for her scraped and torn limbs. She felt dizzy. She could feel the trickle of warm blood turning cold over her frozen fingertips. The fear dwindled to dark curiosity. What could it all mean? And where might it all lead? The cat leapt to action, dragging Alice forward gruffly without seeming to realize it. "Isn't it wonderful? What a magical place!" He tossed her hand down and skipped in a circle before jumping behind and pushing her excitedly. Alice tripped over a crack in the pavement and landed hard on her poor knees. "Well, that was clumsy." The cat looked on, displeased, crossing his arms as Alice looked sorrowfully back at him. "But I'll forgive you," he cried, cackling again. "You'll find everyone falls from time to time here." He covered his mouth with a hand, as if to block everyone but Alice from seeing as he talked from the side of his mouth. "Everyone but the queen, that is." He winked, as if she was supposed to know the meaning of his joke. Alice obeyed the first instruction. She let her eyes gaze over the moon-bathed ghost street. Beside herself and the blue cat, it appeared completely empty. Maybe we can find your way. The cat scratched at its chin, then twirled its whiskers as if thinking deeply. A devious smile crossed his intricate canvas as a long black claw pointed toward the first of the buildings. That way. Come on, follow me. He leapt into a crouch right beside her, long enough to snatch up her wrist again before rushing into a feline bound. Alice did her best to stay on her feet, but dragged most of the way from point A to point B, adding a long scrape of road rash from knee to ankle on the unfortunate leg that fell closest to the ground. Once they came to a stop, she wrestled into a stand. Everything hurt, and since it all hurt the same, nothing hurt too much. The cat waited for Alice to go through the door first. She took 2 steps as the cat slipped a wily foot in her path. The fall to the ground knocked the wind from Alice. She coughed and sputtered as the cat cackled and piped in again. Tisk, tisk, we've come all this way together, and you have yet to ask me my name? Alice's eyes widened at the offense. He was right. Oh, the trouble that would land her in. Have your parents taught you nothing? Not to talk to strangers, Not to follow them into strange buildings? Have you paid any attention to your surroundings? Maybe it's they who should be punished. Alice's lower lip trembled. The cat rolled its eyes and let out a sigh. I'll let this slip slide just this once, but don't be a dunce, or I'll make you my lunch. Now ask me my name, so we might at least be acquainted. Alice placed her shaky hands behind her back, brutally aware of the fatigue threatening to overcome her. What's your name? She asked with as much bravery as she could muster. A wicked grin consumed the creature's face. Alice nearly forgot to open her eyes when she blinked, almost falling into a deep sleep while standing. A sharp pain in her hand and a loud crack and bang rang her back into consciousness. A shock of light pierced the space between them, leaving behind a blast of thick smoke. You think I'd give such an important thing to a stranger who isn't even listening? The smoke poured into Alice's eyes, burning horribly in the process, causing her to fly into a fit of coughing, her empty stomach wrenched. Her throat burned. She backed through the doorway, fruitlessly rubbing at her eyes. The aches spread evenly over her entire body, were awakened and riled by the fit. She whimpered as her back pressed against a flat surface, and found some semblance of relief as she sank to the floor. I think not, and serves you right to be so rude. I think not. The voice had begun to fade along with the smoke. I know a monster when I see one. Alice blinked her burning eyes. The doorway she'd stumbled through appeared empty through her blurred vision. The shock and the cold, sinking in all at once, was more than Alice cared to push through at the moment. And had she tried to exert another ounce of energy, Alice was sure she might pass away. So she stayed, curled around her aching limbs and barking toes. Her lids sank as if guided by heavy weights. Her body followed suit until she was floating suspended in the darkness, comfortably above it all. Just before the sun's first rays were unleashed, the child was rudely awakened by a rough shake. Here, take these. Alice blinked awake. It was the cat creature again. There was a tattered old blanket covering her lower half. She pulled in around herself as the cat extended a hand to offer her the contents. No, she said strongly, overcome by the hunger and frustration in her belly. Alice had lost her inhibitions, and though uncomfortable and groggy, she was thinking more clearly than she had been lately. Oh, the silhouette answered back dangerously. Its teeth flashed in the low light. Whiskers twitched. Yellow eyes shone. And why is that? He questioned ominously. Tick-tock. We haven't time for your silly games, child. You're going to be late. Tick-tock, he sang mockingly.
I'm not allowed to take things from strangers.
She struggled to a sitting position, casting a defiant stare back.
You said so yourself. We're strangers.
The creature chuckled, then cackling, he leapt in a celebratory half-circle. Oh, you clever little being. Maybe you can learn something after all. He brought his face close before continuing. So ask me again. His breath was sickly sweet. Alice mustered her strength.
What is your name?
The creature crept backward. My friends call me Cheshire, but then again, so do my enemies. Or they would if they still had the breath to. He laughed mirthlessly. So tell me, little one, he moved in again. Which are you? Alice pressed into the wall to escape his torturous odor. Friend, she breathed as little as she could, fighting the urge to plug her nose. She rested her hand over the secret weapon in her pocket. If that is true, then you'll do as I say. Alice held out her hand, leaving the other firmly planted in her lap.
I'm coming, Mommy,
she thought, as the Cheshire creature placed bread of some kind in her little hand. Eat it, it hissed. She did, ignoring the unpleasant aftertaste. As soon as she'd swallowed, the painted cat extended a little vial. Drink it. Alice had no strength to resist. She took the tiny jar and relieved it of its contents in one swallow. There was a hint of sweet blended with the penny undertone this time. The cat's building laughter bordered maniacal. Yes. Now go to sleep. For tomorrow you will meet the Queen. His voice faded as an inescapable darkness consumed Alice. She fell to the floor unconscious, in a deep, deep sleep. Her uncanny companion nowhere to be seen. To be continued. Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this segment or would like to have notifications of any upcoming material, please hit like, subscribe, and the little bell so you can get notifications when the next portion comes out. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a beautiful week. God bless.